Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to today's webinar on Aviatrix State of Cloud Network Security 2025. Is our largest industry report to date. I want to appreciate the hard work of our team here at Aviatrix for researching this and engaging over 400 security experts in the networking space to derive this data. I'm Scott Leatherman. I'm on the marketing team at Aviatrix. We've had a really eye-opening findings that I believe will resonate with you. And as many of you who are tuning in today are fighting the same challenges globally. Let me start with why we're here today. Security tools and protocols implemented even just a few years ago are at their breaking point. We continue to experience painful breaches, both professional and personal, despite massive security investments. That's exactly why Aviatrix conducted a comprehensive survey to understand where we really stand with cloud security. We wanted to know how organizations are actually handling this complexity and how they're adapting to the foundational changes, and how does network security fit into the broader cloud initiatives. What we discovered were 6 key trends that I believe will help us focus your investments and your efforts to generally improve your cloud security posture. We have 2 incredible experts with us today. I'm a big fan of both. To dig into this further, I'll let them briefly introduce themselves. Tom, can you kick us off?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Scott. As Scott mentioned, my name is Tom Pageler. I'm the founder and president of Trinity Security, a holistic security firm that provides cybersecurity as well as executive protection. I've had an extensive career in security starting in the late 90s as a special agent with the U.S. Secret Service here in the San Francisco Bay Area. In addition to the protective work, I co-founded the Electronic Crimes Task Force and focused on cyber crimes. I left the Secret Service in 2005 and I've held numerous security roles, leadership roles in payments, fintech, SaaS, telco, crypto. That included Visa, JP Chase, DocuSign, Neustar, and BitGo. I'm also an adjunct faculty at Carnegie Mellon University. I've taught there in their executive education program for CISOs since 2013. Super excited to be here. Thanks, Scott.
Okay. John?
Hi, everybody. My name is John Chen. I'm the CISO here at Aviatrix. I previously served as a head of security architecture at Zoom for 4 years, and this was during the COVID years when Zoom adoption just exploded. I was responsible for the product security side, and towards the latter half of my career at Zoom, really focused on cloud network security and multi-cloud security. And really for that reason why I was really excited about Aviatrix technology and joined Aviatrix. Before Zoom, I was a principal engineer at Cisco Systems, where I led a team to define Cisco's first security development lifecycle. And just a side note, I'll be at Black Hat today and tomorrow. So if anybody wants to connect, please feel free to reach out.
Those are 2 humble bios, as I know both of these humans. Tom has actually made cyber arrest, which is pretty badass. And John, mentioned that he was in Zoom during COVID, and we know how important Zoom all became to all of us and the challenges they faced as people were, actively disrupting and the problems they solved in real time. So again, 2 true CISO perspectives that we are validating here, or validating our experience here today. And so I really appreciate their participation and look forward to some of their answers. Over the next hour, we'll be going to unpack the key findings from the industry report, explore what they mean for your organization. And if we do it right, you should come away with some practical strategies in addressing these challenges, or at the very least, the right questions to ask as you look for the blind spots. So let's dive in and explore the true state of the cloud network security in 2025. Let's start with our first key finding, which you might surprise some of you, or perhaps validate what you've been experiencing firsthand. When we look at cloud firewall adoption, the numbers tell an interesting story. Nearly all US respondents, which is again over 400, 91% of our survey are using firewalls provided by the cloud service provider. That's not surprising given how accessible and integrated these native solutions can be. But here's where it gets interesting. 64% of the same organization are also deploying third-party firewalls and on top of their CSP firewalls. And the challenges don't stop there. At just needing multiple solutions, despite the widespread adoption, 2 out of 3 respondents, or about 67%, are struggling to integrate these firewall tools effectively within their broader security stack. The data reveals that over 55% of our respondents are experiencing performance overhead in their current firewall implementations, while half are citing scalability issues as a major concern. So I'd love to hear from Tom, who's got decades of experience of deploying firewalls. Given these integrations and performance challenges, what are you seeing in terms of your organizations trying to balance the convenience of a native cloud firewall with the needs of a more comprehensive integrated security solutions? And how are teams dealing with the operational complexity of managing multiple firewall layers?
Thanks, Scott, especially for providing those numbers. Those findings definitely resonate with what I'm seeing across the organizations that I work with. I think you're right. Many CISOs and security leaders are trying to save money in integration fees. Therefore, they tend to rely on firewalls provided by their CSPs, especially with the teams that are moving quickly, maybe don't have deep cloud security expertise in-house. Maybe there's smaller companies that are growing fast. These are built into the environment. These firewalls provided by CSPs, they're easy to deploy and often perceived as good enough for initial workloads. So it makes total sense as to why 91% of them are doing that. But as environments scale and threats become more sophisticated, companies grow, many organizations quickly realize that native tools don't always offer the granularity, visibility, or advanced controls they need, especially in a multi-cloud or like hybrid deployments where you have maybe different cloud instances, maybe you have a colo or your own data center, or you could be going through some M&A activity where now you've inherited another cloud. This is where you start layering third-party firewalls, and it helps you to get visibility, but it creates a new problem. And that problem is that this layered approach introduces significant operational complexity. I'm seeing security teams struggle to manage policy consistently because now you've got different types of firewalls in place, different instances. Visibility gaps exist and increase like alert fatigue because you have a lot of stuff coming in. And then integration is a major pain point, especially when the firewalls don't easily talk to your SIEM, your SOAR, XDR system. So honestly, I think this is an awesome question because when you kind of bring this up, what do most CISOs want? I think they want a tool that consolidates all their networks, makes, basically defragments, makes it so what they have to protect is much more controllable, smaller. So, less surface area to protect, into a seamless integration with the ability to holistically see all traffic, detect and prevent threats, enforce policies and control at the core, not impact performance or scalability throughout the company, enable unified monitoring and response throughout the whole environment, and to do this in the most cost-effective way possible. So I think it's a really easy task, but I think that's why the numbers are saying that what we're looking for. I'd love to hear your take, John. I know you actually built like some of the first firewalls, so I'd love to hear what you're thinking.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. So I think just in general at a higher level, right, like firewall and network security is really challenging in the cloud. And there's really three reasons. First, traditionally when you secure a data center, you're really containing all the workloads within a perimeter, and you can sort of enforce your policies at the perimeter. Now, in the cloud, that's no longer true. There's lots of different micro perimeters. Like every VPC that spins up is a new perimeter, and security team have a hard time having visibility into those environments. The workloads are actually much more dynamic as well, right? So the EC2 instances, the Kubernetes pods, things can come up and down. And in addition to that, applications are more distributed. So for example, the latest AI agents, MCP servers, right? You can't even really predict which service your application is going to talk to. So in a much more dynamic distributed environment, static firewall rules are just very difficult, right? And so currently, I would say there's a couple of popular approaches. One is teams may use like a next generation firewall where they will route all the traffic to a central firewall. So this is a very like data center-centric approach, right? But not very cloud friendly and cloud native, right? By having to route all the traffic to a central choke point. This additional data cost is not very elastic. So then the other approach, like what we've been talking about, is using the native CSP firewalls. This could be the actual firewall. Some teams may just use security groups or network ACLs. In this approach, your firewall, your policy is very close to the workload, which is good. But the capability provided by CSP native solutions are actually very limited in terms of firewalling. It's basically IP address based. It doesn't really respond to the dynamic changes in your cloud. So ironically, it's actually not very cloud native and cloud friendly, the policies. So this combination of challenges, I think is, back to your point, Tom, is where, CISOs are looking to fill the gap, right? They're looking for a unified approach, a unified solution across their multi-cloud environment and across their hybrid cloud environment.
That's great. I think the red thread on that is frictionless security, if you will. It is high performance, not slowing down your developers, but defense in depth. And Daniel asked a great question. We'll get to Q&A at the very end of it so we can get through the presentation, and hopefully we have plenty of time to answer some questions. So we'll keep track of those questions, so please keep submitting them, and we'll get to it next. Now let's talk about zero trust, which is a bit long in the tooth in security conversations, if you will, but because of the recent updates from NIST and CISA on the maturity frameworks, maturity models, it's back in vogue again. We're hearing a lot about ZT at trade shows like Gartner and others, Black Hat that's happening. So let's talk a little bit about that. According to our survey, there was a major misalignment between zero trust awareness and actual implementation, particularly when it comes to securing traffic between clouds. The numbers here are quite sobering. When asked about zero trust architectures for securing intra-cloud traffic, only 8% of the US responded are actually using them, 8%. That's incredibly low adoption for something that's been around for 2 decades and is a strategic priority established by the US government and across our industry. We see similar trends when we look at the API security. Despite APIs being critical attack vectors in modern architecture, just 29% of the responders report using zero trust API security models. That's less than 1 in 3. So here's my question to you, John, again. What do you think is driving this massive gap between zero trust as a strategic priority and actual implementation? Are organizations trying to run before they walk? Or is a fundamental infrastructure challenge that needs to be addressed before zero trust becomes particularly a practical rather than aspirational effort?
Yeah, those numbers are incredibly low, and it's somewhat surprising, actually. But when you think about it, maybe it's not all that surprising. I can just take one example, right? So you talked about inter-cloud traffic. It's actually really difficult to do in real life to secure that. For some of the reasons I talked about already, right? So there's perimeters kind of disappearing, and the line between trusted and untrusted environments have blurred, right? So not everything is inside a data center anymore. So teams used to trust kind of internal traffic will be secure, but what's happening now is your internal traffic could be going from one cloud to the next, and it's actually routed through public internet, right? And so essentially the internet become your enterprise backbone. So in that environment, if you want to securely go from one CSP to another, right, you really have a couple options. One is you can try to do this via a private route. So it's not exposed to internet at all. You might go through some backbone IPsec tunnel. You might be routing via private IP addresses. And that's the most secure way to do it. But it's not easy for DevOps teams to figure out how to do that, right? The networking team might have a better chance, but in general, DevOps teams are not as network savvy. And then, so what ended up happening, at least based on what I've seen, is teams simply expose the workloads to the internet, and they'll just use internet, route the traffic over public internet using TLS, let's say, right? So it's all public IP, and it's not really kind of in the spirit of zero trust, but that's the easiest way to get things connected and get your service up and running. So yeah, I think there's still a significant gap in terms of the infrastructure itself, as well as where teams are in the zero trust journey. What do you think, Tom?
Yeah, I mean, 100% agree with you, John. And I think, Scott, those numbers are striking, but honestly, as John said, not surprising. I think we need to recognize, as John said, zero trust is not a new concept. It was a goal that many security leaders had established as their kind of true North Star back when we had better control, as John said, right? Often a single and internally managed hosted environment. It was difficult to achieve then, but we didn't have to worry about the cross, east-west traffic. We worried about, the trust in the environment we controlled. And even though it was pretty difficult back then, we were able to really make it kind of a goal. And I think today it's much more difficult to get zero trust. And I think, as John said, there's a few key drivers behind that gap. I think the first is complexity. Implementing zero trust, especially across cloud-to-cloud traffic and APIs, requires a foundational shift in how organizations think about identity, access, segmentation, and inspection. Most companies simply just aren't architecturally ready for that. Their environments are still siloed, hybrid, burdened with legacy infrastructure that doesn't play well with zero trust principles, or might be going through M&A, and it's like, how do you trust the traffic back and forth between these different instances? You're not just protecting one area. I think the second thing is the lack of clarity. There's still confusion about what zero trust really means beyond never trust, always verify. Many teams conflate it with like MFA, multi-factor authentication, or VPN replacements. But when it comes to applying it to the API layer or between clouds, as John said, the guidance is far less mature and tooling is fragmented. So it's kind of just really difficult to really achieve that. And then I think third is resource constraints. Implementing zero trust properly requires strong cross-functional coordination between networking, cloud, identity, security team. That's a big lift, and especially with all the teams I just mentioned that are always stretched thin and have other priorities. So to get the networking team, the cloud team, the identity team, the security team, the risk team, everybody on the same page is difficult. So to your point, yes, a lot of organizations are trying to run before they can walk. They're setting this strategy without investing in the foundational elements, which is like inventory, asset inventory, consistent identity management, granular visibility across all environments. And most importantly, without defragmenting and simplifying their networks, it just is very, very difficult to get that zero trust. So the ones that I think are making the best progress are treating zero trust as a journey, not a product. They start with high impact areas like maybe user identity, device posture, segmentation, and critical workloads. And then they expand into things like the API authentication, intercloud traffic, all while trying to simplify their networks and their tools and really defragment everything. So bottom line, zero trust is achievable. It has to be broken down to practical staged milestones. Otherwise, it just kind of stays stuck in a, slide in a boardroom rather than something that's actually enforceable to the environment.
I caught something that I want to ask a question back to Tom, if you will.
Okay.
John said something that struck me like a lightning bolt, that the internet has become the enterprise network. And is that the unspoken reality that CISOs know but don't really want to say out loud? I mean, when he said it, it was so subtle. I was like, oh, what? And I just wanted to get your point of view on that, Tom.
Yeah, no, and it's exactly kind of what I framed up is like, look, zero trust was easier when you trusted you could have zero trust in an environment you controlled, which was your own data set and maybe some type of single cloud instance, but it was yours, you controlled it, and you really did kind of have zero trust who was coming and going inside and outside. So it was fine. But now that the internet is the backbone that we use to communicate by these different hybrid approaches, that is scary. Our east-west traffic now suddenly is very different, and we have to do different strategies to get in there. And zero trust in that is much more difficult. And like we said, it's complex, it's not well-defined, it takes multiple teams to work with it, and you are ultimately pushing it out in environments you don't control. So back to my answer on the firewall is like, what are CISOs looking for? They want to bring stuff back in-house. They want control. They want everything to look as like one instance that you can go back to having zero trust and making sure that you can implement properly. So yeah, I think John absolutely nailed it with that.
Okay, thank you. All right, next. This is a great segue into what might be our most concerning finding. Blind spots, or as I like to call them, the gaps, and mind the gap, continue to represent a major threat in cloud network security, and the visibility gap is wider than many organizations realize. More than half of the US respondents, the majority of enterprises, call out network traffic visibility as an area needing significant improvement. That's a red flag when visibility is supposed to be the foundation of an effective security posture. When we look at what organizations are actually using for visibility today, the picture is quite fragmented. Only 20% are leveraging third-party threat intelligence feeds, which indicates a very limited reliance on external context for secure monitoring. Think about that for a minute. In an era where the threat landscapes are global and consistently evolving, where bad actors are leveraging shareware for ransomware, only 1 in 5 organizations are incorporating external intelligence. Meanwhile, more than half, or about 56%, do use third-party observability platforms, but there's a concerning part. 76% are leaning heavily on native tools for their visibility. Now, native tools aren't inherently bad, but they typically provide only basic telemetry and are designed for single cloud environments, which we know is about 5 to 7 years old. So I'm curious, Tom and John, how would you see organizations balance the convenience and cost effectiveness of a native cloud monitoring solution where the needs are comprehensive multi-cloud visibility? And what's your take on threat intelligence integration and why it remains so low despite the obvious benefits? John, why don't you take that one for me first? Or either one, you guys can answer, sorry.
John, you want to go ahead and jump in, or would you like me to?
Sure, I can go first. So I think, similar to the challenges on the firewall side, right? So on the monitoring side, in a multi-cloud environment and distributed environment, it's very difficult to get consistent signals. So let's say if you're using a CSP provided logging solution, right? That's going to look different across your multi-cloud environment, as well as across your on-prem, right? So the format's going to be different, and then the way you analyze them will be different. So for example, the CSP logs, like a VPC flow log from Amazon, the volume is immense, and it's very often overloads the security teams from being able to analyze it. A lot of times the network level logs lack context in the cloud. So all you're getting is IP addresses and ports. And because, as I mentioned before, IP address, and especially IP address changes in the cloud very frequently, right? As your workload go up and down, trying to piece together what happened in the past in that dynamic environment is quite challenging, right? So whether you're using a cloud native tool or you're using a third-party tool. And, to add to all this, I guess, we talked about this a little bit already. There's not really a good solution in the cloud environment to monitor east-west traffic. So a lot of times team probably have pretty good solution in place for egress or ingress. So for example, you might use a web application firewall. For egress, maybe you have a central firewall to do that. But the east-west traffic within your cloud, a lot of times there's lack of visibility there. So as a result, I see a lot of organizations move up the stack. So they will deploy tools like CNAP, right, to scan for CVEs or misconfigurations in the cloud environment, but not do as much on the network side. So there is a real problem here, kind of the absence of integrated multi-cloud or observability layer, which, without those tools, I think security teams are having a hard time piecing together what's going on.
Yeah, I agree with you, John. I think this is a critical issue, and unfortunately one we see play out time and again. Visibility is the bedrock of effective cloud security, but too many organizations are still flying blind in key parts of the environment. Scott, to your question about native tools, they're popular for a reason. They're easy to spin up, tightly integrated with the cloud provider, and often come free or bundled. But the trade-off is that they're limited in scope, as John said. They don't provide deep packet inspection. They don't correlate across multiple cloud or hybrid environments, and they're often lack context for east-west traffic, which is obviously a theme we're talking about, and a critical issue that we're all trying to address. So organizations get lulled into a false sense of security. They think they have coverage, but in reality, they're missing large parts of the picture. So smarter organizations I've worked with are starting to both consolidate their networks, less fragmentation and more control, a theme that I'm going to say over and over, because one of the issues we have right now is I think we keep growing our networks bigger and bigger, and we need to really bring them back in control. But they do this while layering native tools with third-party platforms that provide broader visibility, better correlation, and ability to centralize logs and alerts across multiple environments. It's not an either or decision. It's about building a visibility fabric that spans clouds, regions, and control planes. This is great. However, as I mentioned before, it's not a long-term solution, as the defragmentation of networks are just replaced by fragmentation of third-party tools. Yes, it's better than not having visibility, but it would be way better to defragment the network while at the same time being able to defragment third-party tools. So try to consolidate the network into something that's more visible with a consistent tool across the platform. Then I know we talked about threat intelligence and like external feeds, on that vein. This is where I think we hit both a cultural and operational barrier. Many security teams are still struggling to operationalize threat intelligence in a meaningful way. They don't even have the tooling, as we kind of mentioned before, automation or staff to filter signal from noise. They can't really necessarily interpret everything that's coming in internally. And then you start to get outside feeds. And, just to kind of be blunt, do you trust the outside feeds? Are they actually relevant to you? And I think there's sometimes a fear of security teams to have something from like an external source and report it, but it wasn't actually going to impact you or your customers. So I think there's a little bit of fear in that. I think in today's landscape where threats evolve faster than most orgs can respond, ignoring external intelligence is a missed opportunity. The most mature teams I've seen integrate curated feeds directly into their SIMs. They have an automated response pipeline. Some of them are starting to incorporate AI to kind of help with these things. And honestly, even the better ones sometimes might report something saying, hey, this is a threat, attack, vector, something that's out there. We don't think it impacts you or us yet, but we want you to know about it. So I think the bottom line is visibility isn't just about tools, it's about control, integration, correlation, context, and more importantly, defragmentation, simplification, of the internal, external intelligence, everything. And until organizations treat it at a strategic priority, these blind spots will continue to be exploited.
I don't know. It's such a complex issue and so many layers. The CISO role or the security role has to be the hardest job today in enterprise businesses. I just have such sympathy listening to the answer and the complexity of not being able to trust, a source from the outside or it just is, it's got to be such a challenging role. So my sympathy to the security industry and the people listening on today. So again, hear my true appreciation for everything you're doing to make us a better global economy, actually. Let's actually talk about where it really hurts sometimes, because major investments have been made and budgets are fairly static. So when we asked about budgets, a CFO attention, if you will, about 2/3 or 63% of the US respondents faced unexpected firewall costs in the past year. And now those who experienced cost overruns, about 70%, were on the hook for more than 50,000 in unexpected costs. And so just to run those numbers again, 70% were looking at over 50,000, which is not a small margin of error. And 35%, more than 1 in 3, faced surprise exceedings over 100,000. A 6-digit overrun is painful to anybody at any size company. That's the kind of budget impact that derails quarterly planning and forces difficult conversations with leadership. But what makes this finding particularly puzzling is that these cost overruns are happening despite high confidence levels in forecasting spend. An overwhelming 94% of respondents rated their forecasting accuracy as good or very good. So I'd love to hear from our panelists what you're seeing as the primary culprits behind these massive cost surprises. Is there more about licensing complexity, operational overhead, or organizations simply not asking the right questions during the procurement process? Hey, Tom, since you have the broad background of working with lots of CISOs and students, why don't you answer that first?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, and I'll be honest, this is one of the most common pain points I hear from CISOs and CFOs alike. When you see nearly 2/3 of organizations facing unexpected firewall costs and a third of them getting hit with 6-figure surprises, it's a clear signal that something's broken in the planning process. So as you said, I do teach different courses and not just CISO, CIO, and others and stuff. So I think the disconnect comes down to a few key factors. First for me is licensing complexity. Many firewall solutions, especially in the cloud, use consumption-based pricing models that are hard to predict and really like with egress traffic, inspection volume, rule complexity, those line items can stack up fast. And unfortunately, most teams don't fully understand how those costs accrue until their bill shows up. So like really just understanding that licensing and getting into complexity is very important. Second, hidden operational overhead. It's not just the licensing, it's the staff time. I think the engineering cycles, the integration, sometimes even architectural workarounds required to make firewall functions across different cloud environments, they aren't budgeted properly. So what happens is not only do you have the issue with the firewall coming in and maybe license fees being more expensive, but all of a sudden FTEs increases are needed, or maybe contractors, consultants, integration fees, those kind of things are also hidden fees that suddenly come up and can cause heartburn for the CFO, the CTO, the CISO. Third is the overconfidence in forecasting. I think there's a tendency to check the box during procurement. Teams say, we've accounted for this, but they often don't have complete handle on how cloud firewall usage will scale in dynamic environments, especially with like DevOps pushing rapid deployment and changing traffic patterns. Maybe the company's going to grow, maybe some M&A activity, all these different things. Forecasts based on static assumptions fall apart quickly. So, maybe the CISO is thinking everything's going to stay the same, but they don't really account for the growth of the business or different changes. So to that, I think to mitigate this, I'm seeing more mature organizations do a few things. One is they involve everyone early, and that's the technology, the product team, the security team, the finance team, and actually very important, the really mature ones bring in sales and marketing, because then they know how much are we growing, what are we forecasting, because then you can look at the prices and say, okay, today we're using it for this amount, but we forecast and predict next year it's going to be a 5x increase. What does that actually cost us? Then I think you've got to consolidate what you can, see if there's are tools that are natively offered like inside your CSP or something like that. Are there certain things that you can have done with your homegrown internal tools that don't ramp up, or that maybe you can get a discount as you come in because it's part of the overall picture. I think demanding transparency from vendors is also key. Ask for detailed price breakdowns and gotchas up front. Just say, hey, look, I want to do this. You sold me all this stuff. What is the maximum, it will cost me? Like we're predicting whatever, 100 gigs of some kind of analysis. What if I get up to, 1,000 gigs? What happens then? Have those answers up front. And then monitor in real time. I mean, security leaders, we're good at tools that provide real time, like reporting and stuff. So like also just develop something that says, how much am I taxing that firewall? Am I tracking the way I predicted? Is my usage of it increasing? And if that does, what does that mean financially? And get on the phone with a vendor right away, because if you get to a point where you're like, hey, the costs are going up so much, I can't afford this, they'd rather not lose a customer. So ultimately, I think it comes down to treating cloud firewall strategy as a holistic decision from the entire company. I think that's the number one thing. When everyone is aligned and working together, you can simplify your environment, lower costs, and avoid a lot of the surprises. John, I'd love to get your take.
Well, my first reaction is I should probably take your class at CMU. I think you covered this really, really well. I actually don't have that much to add. I think all the tips that you've given makes a lot of sense to me. The numbers are sobering, right? Like the unpredicted cost. I guess the only thing I will add is sometimes there's also architectural issue, right? How you set up your network and your environment. So going back to kind of the centralized firewall approach, right? I think it works okay for small environments. If your VPC, for example, is set up in a hub and spoke model already, then you just overlaying the firewall on top of that. That's not going to incur as much cost versus where if you have a fairly disjoint and spread out environment and you're forcing all the traffic to be routed back to the central next generation firewall for egress and ingress. It's a very common thing we see, right? And this centralized firewall could be in the cloud, and sometimes it could be even back in the data center. So companies will route the traffic from the cloud back to the data center just to do the firewall. And both of those scenarios incur a lot of additional cost in terms of data transfer, right? Just because of the way you architect it. And what's kind of ironic sometimes is you route all that traffic, pay the cost to get to the firewall, just for it to be dropped, right? So maybe another way to think about this also is how can you re-architect your environment into a more cloud-native distributed environment and have the policies enforced closer to workload to reduce that cost.
I appreciate the tips and tricks from both of you. I hadn't really grokked that something like a CI/CD or serverless environment could actually be disrupting and be the result of the cost overruns as well. So I appreciate you sharing that. So let's move on for the sake of time. Let's address what might be one of the most critical gaps in modern security architectures. DevOps security and east-west traffic controls are either non-existent or significantly lagging behind what needs to be. The survey numbers here are quite stark. Almost half, 46% of the US respondents face major challenges securing DevOps pipelines, with another 39% experiencing what they classify as minor issues. But let's be honest, when we're talking about DevOps pipeline security, there's no really minor issue, if you will. That means 85% of organizations are struggling with securing their very process that deliver their applications to production. The situation with east-west traffic is equally concerning, with more than half, or about 52%, reporting difficulty managing east-west traffic in their environments today, which is the common communications between services within the same environments, particularly within Kubernetes clusters and cloud-native applications. Given that DevOps pipelines are east-west traffic are fundamental to how modern applications operate. John, why don't you take this question, and as the area remains such a significant blind spot that we're dealing with the tooling limitations, organizational silos, and this is more about the fundamental capacity of securing the ephemeral distributed architecture. In your experience here across Zoom and your long tenure, I'm sure you've come across these challenges and addressed them.
Yeah, sure, I'm happy to. So if you look at any of the APTs or ransomwares, right, that's making headline today, like Scatter Spider and Salt Typhoon, right? So there's really three different stages, right? There's the infiltration into the environment, there's that lateral movement across your environment, and then this exfiltration of data or ransomware. So when we talk about east-west traffic, we're really talking about that lateral movement, right? And modern applications are architected in a way that, most of the communication are through that east-west lateral communication, right? If you think about it like a distributed microservice architecture, where things in Kubernetes. But what we see is a lot of companies primarily focus on that infiltration piece, like protecting the identity or, putting some kind of wall around your environment, right? But any of the recent attacks, you probably noticed that you probably should assume the attacker is in your environment already. And then how do you actually prevent the kill chain from keep happening, right? So how do you control that east-west traffic? And so currently, and one of the reasons why it's difficult is, we talked about this a little bit already, currently there's just not a good solution to do this in a cloud-native way. So if you look at the CSP provider solutions, again, it's all IP-based, right? And there's not a good way to respond to the dynamic nature of cloud apps and have visibility and control over that east-west traffic. I will say, might be a little biased here, but when Aviatrix introduced a cloud-native security fabric, it's a distributed enforcement point. Like you can define your security policy centrally, and the distributed enforcement points are across your multi-cloud environment in your VPCs. So whenever traffic is routed through the VPCs, CNSF does have visibility and can tell the security teams what's happening, right? Or can block those lateral movements. Now on the DevOps environment, there's historically, heavy friction between DevOps and security teams, right? So I ran into this many times, because developers and DevOps teams, they're racing really, really fast, trying to get their features out, right? I encounter situations where like it's 2 o'clock in the morning, the feature is finally done, they want to deploy it. Where's the security team to approve this deployment, right? So either the security team has to stay up with them to review this, or maybe find somebody in a different time zone, right? So the friction between DevOps and security mainly results, I think, from manual review of these deployments, right? Somebody has to go in, look at the artifact manually. So it has to be at the right time. So I think what we really need to work towards is an automated approach for DevOps teams to make those deployments. So security team might put in some guardrails, right? And as long as the deployment fit within those guardrails, the deployment can happen automatically, right? So there may be some like automation in the pipeline to enable that. So remove that kind of manual review and friction, unless it's absolutely necessary, right? So in both cases, I think there's a lot of things, there's a lot of challenges, but also a lot of things we can do to improve. Now, Tom, maybe to you, and I'd love to hear your input on this as well.
No, I agree with everything you said, John. I think one area that I'll talk a little bit about is I agree with you, DevOps and security have friction, and I think there's ways to address that. When nearly 9 out of 10 organizations are struggling with DevOps pipeline security, that's not a marginal issue. It's a systemic risk, right? That's 90%. So I think really like look at this, and you are right. I think that we need to get the tooling right. I really do believe CNSF will be an answer, because I think there's answers for both DevOps and security in there, and working together and saying, hey, look, now we can get at this core. We can actually look at the east-west traffic. I think in order to get there, we have to look at like the 3 big challenges, and I think it's complexity, culture, and visibility. And what I mean by complexity is the DevOps pipelines, east-west traffic, and cloud-native environments, just as John said, highly dynamic by nature. Containers spin up and down in seconds. Services shift, access to nodes, everything. It's a very complex environment, and it just causes issues for DevOps and security. Second is the cultural gap, which I agree with John, has been mentioned multiple times. There's still a major divide between security and DevOps. I mean, they just have fundamentally different objectives, right? Security is to make sure everything slows down and is secure. DevOps is to continually integrate and continually deploy and get stuff moving. So just by nature, there's going to be friction. Security often isn't baked into the pipeline. It's bolted on after the fact. And when security introduces friction, DevOps teams find workarounds. I'm not blaming either one. I understand why security does it. I understand why DevOps does it. Until security is seen as an enabler, not a blocker, it's going to remain a blind spot for everybody. And I think I'm going to go back on when I was a CSO of a crypto company, it was securing billions and billions of dollars in assets. So we put the DevOps team under the security team. And it was a lot of friction in the beginning. Now, I don't think every organization can do this, especially because security is not your product. You slow things down. If you're not producing, then obviously you're not going to have money to have a security team. But it was interesting to do that and experiment with that, because we did delay some development, but we also didn't have the breaches. We were able to remain secure. And what also happened was the DevOps team and security team, they started to work in each other's shoes. So we would take some DevOps leaders, put them for like 6 months on the security team and vice versa. So they started to actually wear each other's shoes. Now, I'm not saying every organization can do that, but when they did do this, a lot of them got kind of eye-opening. So suddenly I'm a security leader on DevOps. Now my pressure is different. I need to push things out, but I do know how to make it secure. So I do go a little bit faster, and vice versa. I'm a DevOps person who now has to secure stuff, so I know how to slow down a little bit. And I think they kind of got better understanding there. And then I think the third thing is the tooling and ownership fragmentation. There's no single tool, as John said, that secures the full DevOps pipeline, east-west traffic out of the box. You need to, coordinate mix of code scanning, secret management, services, mesh policies, everything, microsegmentation, everything needs to be done. And so that's why I said I think the CNSF is actually one of the best things, because it's kind of letting us go back to that core, defragmenting things, bringing teams together so you can take both a security and a DevOps approach looking at it. And I think it's kind of aligned with the more advanced organizations I've been working with that do a few critical things like embedding security early in the CI/CD pipeline, things like infrastructure as code scanning, container hardening, automated checks before deployment, adopting service mesh or zero trust principles internally. Again, that journey, not the product, inspect and control east-west traffic without relying on traditional perimeter models, defragmenting where possible, both tools and the cloud. And most importantly, shifting that mindset, building shared responsibilities between security and engineering so controls are both effective and frictionless. And again, I know, John, you mentioned CNSF. I think it's a great place to start, because there's so much coming out of that saying, hey, how can we use this and this ability to see more, to be more secure and move stuff faster?
Thank you both. It wouldn't be 2025 if we didn't transition to an AI conversation. it wouldn't be a webinar if we didn't do it. I think you have to check the box. But actually, I'm really excited because it is not the doom and gloom story that we've been kind of running through. It's actually good news. So let me transition to that. And finding in our research that shows the security industry is embracing transformational topics and technologies at an unprecedented pace. Of course, I'm talking about AI here. According to the survey, 95% of respondents are leveraging artificial intelligence and machine learning for threat detection. That's nearly universal adoption, which is extraordinary for any technology, let alone one that's considered emerging or just a few years ago. But here's what's even more impressive. 57% of organizations aren't just dabbling with AI, they're using it extensively. More than half of the security teams have moved beyond a pilot program and proof of concepts into full-scale AI implementations. John, do you have any thoughts on what's driving this rapid and extensive AI adoption in security specifically? I'm also curious, are you seeing this translate into measurable improvements in threat detection and response times, or are organizations still working through the operational challenges of integrating AI into the security workflows? And one last multi-question question. And when it comes to outcomes, what are you hearing from organizations using AI extensively in their maturity curve versus those who are just getting started? What's the learnings you both have captured here? But I'll go back to John first. And the TLDR on all of that is, are we still whitewashing with AI, or are we actually implementing it and seeing real value?
Glad we're able to talk about AI, right, in the webinar. So I think the use of AI represents a fundamental shift in how security operations are conducted. We're going from kind of nice to have in terms of AI to a real competitive advantage for our teams. We're rapidly seeing the entire instance response process being automated by AI, right? So I've talked to a number of startups that's focused on this already. And what they're really trying to do is just emulate a human detection and response engineer. So the AI might be trained out of the box, or it might monitor what the human is doing, right? And then learn from that. But the net result is, for a vast class of instance, pretty soon, I think you'll see AI agents to be able to respond to this automatically. So the agents will have access to the HR information, the network information, all kinds of information within the enterprise to be able to actually respond to an instance. So like the security team doesn't have to wake up 3 a.m. to respond to those. So I think it's a real sea change, and I think it's a really exciting kind of set of technologies coming down the pike. And a lot of security tools themselves are integrating AI, right? So I probably start to see a lot of tools that support simple, like LLM type of prompts to let the user interact with the system, right? So before, you might write like a really complex query to search for something. Now you just use a natural language prompt. So that's kind of the simple integration. And the deeper integration, as Scott, as you mentioned, is using AI to kind of analyze the threat intel data, right, to reduce false positives and come up with actionable items for security teams to respond to. So I think those trends are very real. And like this week being Black Hat, I'm sure more interesting features are being announced at the conference. And then the second part of your question, I think on the general corporate sort of IT adoption side, I feel like because AI is such an exciting technology, the deployment's getting ahead of the ability for a security team to really monitor and review and control it. So I think I saw an article just over the weekend. McKinsey has like thousands of AI agents deployed in their environment, right? So it feels very similar to shadow IT and of the past, where folks are just spinning up different resources outside of what IT security team can comprehend. And I think very similar things happening with AI deployment in the enterprise environment. And being a network security company, I would say one of the things you can do to mitigate some of the risk is to have a secure network infrastructure so that the AI agents, AI deployments have kind of a sandbox around them, right? Or kind of some sort of moat around them to prevent things like some of the stuff we talked about, lateral movement, exfiltration, right? So at least a kind of a guardrail in place at the network layer. Yeah, but it's a big topic. I mean, I think I'm sure Tom has lots of input here as well.
I'm going to agree with you. I do think that, AI is no longer just a buzzword, on a slide on a vendor deck. It's actually being operationalized, and it's a big deal. I was actually talking to a friend of mine who is at a very large corporation where they have completely gotten rid of their security analysts and fully reliant on AI, and they're actually having better response and everything. However, they did say a lot of their analysts are now setting the AI. So I think it's like you need to get AI in there, like John said, but you also don't just use AI. It's not like ChatGPT. You can go tell it to write you a paper. It'll write a paper. The paper will probably be decent, but it might misquote things. It might go in the wrong direction and everything. The real use case of AI is saying, okay, I can train AI to do better than a human and detect things, but I need to make sure it's doing what it's supposed to do. So you take the analyst and you train it, and you get the right segmentation, the right setup there. I think also another interesting thing is we're seeing more and more, this is back in my criminal days, looking at, I always look at the cyber fraud and stuff like that. There's nefarious AI being used by bad actors. So now if you don't have AI, you're actually at a disadvantage. And I'll use the movie The Terminator as a great example, right? So the Terminator is coming back to destroy John Connor. How do you protect him? How do you send another Terminator? So a Terminator is used to stop a Terminator. It's the same with AI. If you have nefarious AI that's just hitting everything, it's going faster than any human can or anything. So you need to bring AI in order to defend against the other AI. And I think that's a pretty interesting thing. So sometimes even the nefarious use cases push the good use cases because you have to do it. I think that what we're seeing is that really separates those leaders, the ones who are embedding AI across the life cycle. So as John said, not just kind of doing a little bit here and there out of the box, but from threat intel and vulnerability management to behavioral analytics and automated responses. They're not using it as a standalone tool, but as part of a cohesive integrated security strategy. They also have the right talent and governance in place, people who can manage the models, interpret the outputs, and continuously tune the system. So the person I mentioned, they actually, when they deployed their AI, they went historically back and said, okay, we found 100 incidents. Let's make sure AI finds at least 100. Let's make sure they don't do too many false positives, cause issues. And then on top of that, they actually brought in their compliance and audit team, who routinely, quarterly is auditing and checking the compliance and making sure the AI is doing what it's supposed to do independently, which I think is great. And then also the ones that are really doing well, they're focused on defragmentation and consolidation, the theme I've been saying over and over. So deploy the AI, but try to deploy it to less of an environment, less place to protect. And then finally, they're not just measuring detection rates, they're measuring mean time to detection, the MTTD, and mean time to response, MTTR. And ultimately, being able to prove that business risk is being reduced by AI. So AI is absolutely transforming the game. But like any tool, it's only effective as the strategy and people behind it. The future is promising, but it requires intentional design, not just automation for automation's sake.
That's great. We are running a little short on time. We're going to do a Q&A. I want to thank everybody for this excellent discussion. There's a couple questions, if we can get a couple quick answers. But the one that's been kind of the top of my list from Daniel, why wouldn't a second firewall, other party, if you will, be seen as defense in depth? Anybody?
John, you want to take? Sure. I would say, John, you're the firewall expert.
I can go first, I guess. I think it's a very valid approach, right, to adopt a third-party firewall in your cloud environment, because as we said, I think the cloud-native firewalls are very limited in their feature set. So I think it's a good idea to adopt a new firewall. But just as we talked about, you want to think about architecturally how you are integrating that firewall, right? So like the example I gave, if you're routing all the traffic to a single choke point, that might not be the best way to do it. Well, maybe it works for your environment, right? So you really have to evaluate what your cloud architecture looks like, and then think about from a third-party vendor perspective, what type of firewall and how you would like to distribute that firewalling into your cloud environment. So I think that's a key in terms of picking a third party.
And I'll add with John, I think he's absolutely right. And then the architecture is important, especially if changes are made, because one of the problems is you can do that and then M&A changes an environment, an extra incident spun up in a different cloud. Suddenly, yes, that firewall does cover a certain amount, but is it covering the new environment? Is it able to do that? So again, the more complex, the more tools, the more things we layer on, it's just things you have to go back and check as you make adjustments to your environment.
All right, I got another one. This one's from Denise. How are teams improving visibility into east-west traffic and lateral movement in multi-cloud environments?
John, you want to take the first stab at it, or you want me to?
Yeah, so it's a great question. We covered this a little bit in our talk, but I think you really want to think about going with a cloud native approach, right? So instead of bolting on kind of traditional data center approaches into the cloud, you want to think about your multi-cloud environment almost as a mesh, right? Because like your enterprise corporate network now is the internet plus these different cloud networks, right? So how can you look at your entire sort of infrastructure holistically, think about it as a mesh, and then think about how you apply policies across this mesh, right? So things like east-west traffic, right? As I said, I'm partially biased, but I think the CNSF solution from Aviatrix does a really good job in terms of inspecting traffic going east-west. And this is not just within one cloud, but like going from, for example, AWS to Azure, right? You can have inspection points along the way. So I'll say this, maybe be a little more creative and then look at broader set of solutions that's available today compared to what's traditionally on the data center side.
I'll just jump in and add to John. I think CNSF will be a great answer. My time at Visa, we created the payment card industry data security standards. The whole idea there was you could be compliant with Amex, but not Visa, or MasterCard, not Amex, whatever. And getting like a standard that we could all follow, so to say, hey, at least we're at the minimum security. And I think CNSF really outlines how you can get into that native fabric and actually more visibly see things across platforms. So the more we all get into a standardization of this, it will allow us more visibility and won't matter which cloud instance you're talking to. So I think John's made excellent points there.
Great. And I'll say the overarching theme here is that organizations need integrated multi-cloud aware solutions that address these systemic issues rather than adding more point solutions and complexity to the already fragmented landscape. The key difference within Aviatrix is the cloud native data and control plane enabling security from the inside out. Aviatrix lives where the data lives and moves. We can stop the bad actors from moving east and west, give transparency to your entire global network, and stop exfiltration of data. We work with solutions like Wiz or CloudStrike seamlessly to improve your security and security posture. Aviatrix is the real-time remediation to alerts of Wiz and zero trust postures in a multi-cloud network. If you are looking for more information, check out Aviatrix State of Cloud Network Survey 2025, QR code there. It's also available on our website. You can also register for a free Aviatrix security audit to find the gaps or even the bad actors sitting and waiting in your network today. Thank you to everyone for joining today. Be sure to follow Aviatrix and on LinkedIn, as well as John and Tom, as they are helping the global ecosystem of security leaders stay ahead of the rise of cyber attacks and cybersecurity trends. With that, if you have any direct interest or requesting a demo or connection, we saw a request from Akotis, please just put into chat your name and number, and we'll reach out to you instantly and follow up on your request. I do appreciate everybody's participation today in what is a global security posture. We are standing together as one team to make the world a better, safer place for us to do business. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.